Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on the future of the European Green Deal. My name is Paul. I am with Youth and Environment Europe, which is an umbrella organization for youth grassroots movements across the European continent. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to be moderating this conference today, along with Stefano from the Earth Society. And before we begin, I simply wanted to thank first our audience for coming and taking the time to listen to this conversation, both on site and online. I wanted to thank all our panelists for preparing and joining us today in answering all the questions that we have prepared for them. And I specifically wanted to thank the Earth Society because they are at the initiative of this conference. They came to us with the concept. And for this, I am very thankful. I also wanted to thank the VUB for making this conference possible. They've been an amazing logistical support, and they've allowed us to use this amazing room with all this fancy equipment. So for all of that, I'm very thankful. And before I hand out the microphone to you, Stefano, I simply wanted to say that this conference happens in a bit of a peculiar context that needs to be reminded. The European Union has just gone through a historic round of election. We have a new European Parliament that has noticeably shifted towards the right. And given that the European Green Deal, which is this historic legislative package that is prompting us towards carbon neutrality, has been started with the Green Wave of 2019, it is logical to wonder what this right pivot of the Parliament will mean for the future of this Green Deal and for environmental legislation at the EU level in general. So without further ado, I'm giving you the microphone, Stefano, to introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm going to introduce the different speakers. Sebastian Obertour, co-director of the Research Center for Environment, Economy and Energy, professor for Environment and Sustainable Development at the Brussels School of Governance. Arvea Marieni, partner and board members at Brains Capital, shareholders and lead of Ecological Transition Division at BeamCube. Flora Dicke, researcher at the Ecologic Institute in Berlin. Andrea Casamenti, policy coordinator at Solidar. Stephanie Olivieri, project leader for Sustainware at Youth and Environment Europe. For what concerns the program, now we will have the introduction by Professor Sebastian regarding an overview on the European Green Deal. And then Flora will give a presentation on the 4i Traction project findings. Then we will move to the panel discussion, where we will analyze through our speakers what is the future for the European Green Deal after the elections. At 5:30, we will move to the Q&A session. We will then conclude our panel discussion, and at 6 p.m. move to our networking cocktail. Thanks.
So that is much more than just the environment. It's a growth strategy. It's much more than just climate. It's about biodiversity. It's about chemicals. It's about the full sustainability agenda. It's about equity as well. Growth strategy, perhaps what I can also say, I was reading today the European Green Deal, which is a communication originally by the Commission, right? And it says, we are aiming for a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. Well, we can come back later to what extent that will still hold for the next Commission, but it sounds like a good motto. If you listen to the debates that we have about the new Green Industrial Deal, about competitiveness, it's already in there in a way. So what I also wanted to present still is the framing of the so-called Fit for 55 package. And now we are zooming in a little bit on the climate part of the European Green Deal, which is obviously also in the public debate the most prominent bit of the EGD, European Green Deal. And it's an enormous package of legislation, which has been mostly adopted by now in the last legislative term. It's not the only thing that has happened under the European Green Deal. There is much more. The Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, etc., come on top of this. The Nature Restoration Law that was just adopted yesterday, was it? Or the day before yesterday, is also not in the Fit for 55 package. So the legislation under the European Green Deal is much broader than this, but these are the most important parts of the climate legislation that has been adopted, and it's called Fit for 55. Obviously, in order to realize the 55% emission reduction goal of the European Union by 2030, although many of the measures will have relevance beyond 2030 and are also supposed to pave the way towards the climate neutrality target in 2050. And if we look ahead, the European climate law that was adopted in 2021, is also not part of the Fit for 55 package, even has the goal of having net negative emissions after 2050, which is something that will also be necessary. So this is an enormous package, hundreds of pages of legislation that covers, and you see it a little bit, a lot of transport also, international transport, aviation, maritime, alternative fuels infrastructure, that is also nationally, a lot of energy efficiency, renewable energy, the energy taxation directive that you see there is the only piece that has not been adopted, because there's unanimity required amongst member states to do so. So it's an enormous scope. A lot of new targets have been established. The policy mix has been broadened, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, an economic instrument that will make imports of carbon-intensive products more expensive. CO2 emission standards for cars and vans, you see there, we have obviously followed the debates, I assume, about the end of the internal combustion engine. All that we can discuss later on, I assume. So there's also a strong external dimension with this. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is obviously something that many partners of the EU in the world are very concerned about, how that will impact them. An enormous package, and I assume we can go into some of those later on in the debate. I just wanted to make that clear. Also, just from the experts' perspective, if you read through that and you imagine that all of this has been adopted within a time span of 2.5 years, it's enormous. What has happened and what has been achieved already, bearing in mind that we obviously need to go much further if we want to get to climate neutrality. But we'll have the chance to go deeper into that, also on what might be required as next steps, which I think will come up next. Thanks very much.
Up next, Flora, I'll give you the floor for the findings of the 4i Traction project.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. As was said, I'm Flora. I work with Ecologic Institute, a Berlin-based think tank in sustainability, environment, and climate. And I've been working with the 4i Traction project. Sounds very fancy. We've been concerning ourselves with transformative climate policy. And with we, I mean a consortium of 9 organizations. So it's not my work. A lot of people have worked on what I'm going to talk about for the past, nearly 4 years. And we looked at gaps and recommendations. As Sebastian said, a lot still needs to happen. And we've been wondering, okay, but what? So you might wonder 4i, what does it stand for? We're talking about integration. Sebastian named that before, innovation, investment, and infrastructure. So we didn't want to look in the project from a sectoral perspective, but we wanted to look at cross-cutting areas. And with these 4 I's, We wanted to cover different aspects. Looking at it from the perspective today, we maybe should have considered inclusiveness and information as well. But afterwards, you're always more clever than before, right? So looking at the gaps that we still see in the transformation towards climate neutrality for integration, so basically taking a holistic approach and integrating climate policy in different sectors, what we see is that it's very uneven across sectors. In the energy sector, climate aspects are very much integrated already. In the agricultural sphere, maybe not so much. And what we also see is that the coordination of the other aspects of innovation, investment, and infrastructure needs to get better, and it's still quite deficient. In terms of innovation, we also see a lack across the innovation chain. So basically starting with research, going through deployment stages of new technologies, but also demonstration stages, we see that a lot needs to happen. We have innovations like solar panels and offshore wind, and you say, it's not an innovation anymore, right? It's a mature technology. However, we still need to deploy it much more. For other technologies like smart grids and batteries, there's still a lot needs to happen also in demonstration stages and research. An issue here is also that there is issues with funding, and with that I come to the next I, investment. Our colleagues in France from I4CE, they have done research on this, and they estimate that there is an investment gap of 406 billion euros annually. So basically the deficit of what we should be spending or what we should be investing in the climate transformation compared to what we're investing now. And also the framework that we have right now is insufficient to mobilize these funds. In the area of infrastructure, we see that the rollout of the necessary infrastructure to reach climate neutrality is going too slow. And this goes especially for energy and transport infrastructure. And we see that there is a lack of a comprehensive strategy, especially for the EU for transnational systems and infrastructure. So these are the issues. And let's see what we have on the table in terms of recommendations. I'm going to run through this, and I hope I'm not going to run too fast. But we kind of outline 5 areas where we see a necessity for change. Basically in the area of integrated and participatory climate governance, in the area of directionality and certainty to provide this, in an area of regional differentiation and experimentation, market creation and alignment, and lastly, sufficient and certain funding. So you do see that those I's that we've been looking at are definitely represented there. And we've drawn out some concrete recommendations for a future of European climate policy, for a future of the European Green Deal, for a future of Fit for 55. So we'll see. In the area of integration, we mainly highlight that we need to give principal priority to climate. So further integrating climate aspects into all areas of policy. And that we there also need to look at the do no harm principle. I think you might have heard about this before. And for that, for example, we could include new provisions in the European climate law, which already exists, which prioritizes climate policy integration in EU policymaking. Furthermore, we say we need to open channels for meaningful citizen engagement, basically touching up on that inclusiveness eye that we kind of missed in the beginning. So as to include citizens and stakeholders into the discussion for policymaking, and kind of anchor that, for example, in the governance regulation that already exists. We're also recommending that there should be EU long-term strategy, and we have an EU long-term strategy. I think it was written 2018 or 2019, which kind of lays out how the EU wants to achieve the Paris Agreement. Every member state has to write long-term strategies. And this also in a 10-year cycle, renew them, update them. The EU doesn't have a mandate kind of to update this. There's no provision on this, and we say there needs to be a provision on this because we have to check where we're going and where we stand on a more regular basis as the EU in total. Now, moving on to infrastructure and the issue of necessary directionality, we suggest to have a strengthened EU integrated infrastructure planning. So we suggest that to accommodate the needs for climate neutral energy and transport systems, especially, we have to coordinate, especially transnational infrastructure that needs to be built. Because if we have lots of offshore wind, for example, in the north in Belgium, this might has to go somewhere, right? So it doesn't all stay in Belgium. So transnational coordination is a role the EU should definitely take on stronger, and the institutions that exist for that need to be strengthened. Moving on a bit to innovation, talking about coordinated and managed fossil fuel phase out. Now, you might wonder, what does it have to do with innovation? We're also talking about ex-innovation. We kind of need to push incumbents out of the market. The ETS kind of does that because we have a cap. So eventually fossil fuel users will be pushed out. But we suggest to also anchor concrete timelines for specific fuels and technologies in respective regulations. So also to signal to investors a certainty, to other stakeholders and to consumers where we're heading, and that this is clear. We have done that with the combustion engine kind of end with, what is it now? 2025? 35, yes. Exactly. So
sorry, but it's also very precise to say that the legislation is legislating out and phasing out technology. That is,
yes, definitely. Like it's I mean, it's a percentage of fuels, etc. That's kind of
it's a technical requirement in terms of emissions. That's it. It's a technical limit of that particular technology related to fossil fuel applications. That's it.
Thank you for adding that, specifying. Now moving on. Oh, I skipped that one. Sorry. As the EU is a big economic area, and there are very different needs in different regions, we also suggest to have clusters, local clusters, regional clusters, to align innovation and infrastructure there and support where necessary innovation in these areas and is needed for that innovation. For example, we have EU emission calls. That's an instrument of the EU. And there we could allow regional clusters to apply for funding specifically for their cluster and for that region to spearhead innovation in that area. Now, moving on to the deeply green innovation, we suggest to build more strongly European green lead markets. So the green lead markets can ensure that there's a predictable demand for low emission products and processes, particularly in basic materials such as steel, cement, and fertilizers. And we suggest that there should be an EU strategy for creating lead markets for basic materials and streamlining existing processes in that area. To get concrete, there are directives that address public procurement, and there you could streamline more environmentally sustainable options as the norm. And one could also consider the introduction of tradable quotas or standards for end products in this area. Now to the last block, which is on sufficient and certain funding. We have several recommendations. I think my time is soon over, so I don't want to overstretch it now. but we need transformative public funding. There is a very big funding landscape already in the EU. This needs to be made more coherent and accessible. Also, we need a better plan. So where is money needed? When is it needed? By whom is it needed? Kind of have a better overview and coordination in that area. And lastly, a concrete recommendation is regarding the prudential transition plans for banks. This is an instrument for the banking sector. These prudential transition plans have been introduced in regulation, and they kind of mandate banks to align their lending activities, especially with climate goals. So we don't want to invest much more money in fossil fuels, and it's actually also risky to keep going into that direction potentially. So now plans like companies already have to make prudential transition plans, and this is rather recent development. And one suggestion here is that we need more clear guidance on these plans, what needs to be included, and the European Banking Authority could be an actor to provide this. And then the banks should be required to develop detailed and actionable strategies with scientifically credible 2050 targets. And these plans, again, should be verified by banking supervisors. So this is a very big picture across the whole spectrum that we've been looking at, where we see a need and for these gaps to be closed and how they could be closed to move to more transformative climate policy. And as I said before, perhaps there are some holes in these recommendations. You could add something on inclusiveness. You could add something on agriculture. It's a sector we haven't been looking at that much. But I hope that we can discuss this in the upcoming panel discussion and later with your Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Flora. I wish we had more time to ask questions and to go deeper into your project because it's fascinating, really. As a general introduction, I just would like to remind you, and maybe to remind myself specifically, the reason we're here today is because we've just been through a round of European elections. I, as a French person, completely forgot that this was even on the agenda because of, the political mess that we're having right now. But because we have a new European Parliament and because powers have been kind of shifting since the last election in 2019, we thought it would be a right moment to start asking questions about what will be happening in the future and in the next 5 years with the European Green Deal and more generally with the environmental legislations. So I think to kick things off, I just wanted to start with a very broad question, and this one is addressed to all our speakers. Maybe we'll start from right to left. So I'll start with you, Stephanie. What do you think globally and in your own words, do you think is the result of the election going to impact the future of environmental legislation in the EU? And specifically, what aspects do you think of the Green Deal is most at risk or will be most affected?
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Stephanie and I'm part of Youth and Environment here. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I think that the rise of the far-right parties in Europe, particularly supported by young voters, which me coming from a youth-led organization, we just quite worried about, threatens, I think, to undermine the EU environmental policies and offers, of course, a potential rollback of essential environment initiatives that are crucial for a sustainable future. And now we're seeing how the nature restoration law, for example, was just passed, and there is this whole internal issue going on in Austria, and it could potentially also come to the EU stage. So I think that this shift could jeopardize key aspects of the European Green Deal, such as ambitious emissions reduction targets, renewable energy investments, and of course biodiversity protection as well. So I'm afraid that this growing far-right influence, driven also by anti-immigration and anti-elite sentiments, which we can see in so many countries, if not in all of the EU countries, risks deprioritizing climate action in favor of nationalist agendas. And I think like that, it's fashion to say that at least the Nordics, they show to be in a different path than the rest of Europe like that. It gives us a little bit of hope, but it's still minority.
Thank you. Andrea?
Yes, hi everyone. I would say I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic, or anyway, I hope I'm right. We still have most likely, negotiations are ongoing now between the groups. So of course, we won't know until the Commission President is going to nominate it, maybe already next week, and until when the groups are formed and the first plenary then in mid-July. But I do still think that since it seems that the majority is going to be a pro-climate majority of EPP, but of course also then with the SND, so the Social Democrats, most likely also the Liberals and the Greens, then I have hope in the fact that this majority will still move forward with climate policy. Of course, not as strongly and as ambitiously as it was in the case in the past 5 years. But we tend also to indeed, the rise of the far right is of course very scary, but they don't have a majority. What we fear the most actually at this time is the possibility of the EPP taking on the same narrative as the far right, meaning, it's climate policies that are causing the cost of living crisis and that is ruining the life of people. So that's a real danger. The far right, of course, will have the opportunity to slow down things or block things, but it's more the role that the EPP will decide to have that is quite scary in this situation. But once again, the progressives have a very important role to play in the negotiations at this moment. If a majority is created of more pro-climate groups, so that's the hope that we have, and that's the kind of conversations we're having now with progressive groups.
Thank you so much, Flora.
I may be a bit more on Andrea's side, still having hope. I think, however, that the results are concerning and it shouldn't be ignored. And just because we can still keep going with the green policies, it is a warning. It is a warning sign. And we have to consider the voters that wrote far-right parties and are maybe not pro-climate change policy, for example. However, as Andrea said, I think there's not going to be an extremely strong rollback because, as Sebastian said, a lot of the Fit for 55 package has actually been already put into place, shaped into regulations and directives. We're also binded by international agreements to the targets we set ourselves, but I think there's definitely the risk that the transformation that is going on is going to slow down, and that, for example, we'll see with the 2040 targets that's soon going to be set, where this is going to go, and if the ambition stays high or not with the majorities that we'll find. So, yes, it is concerning. We might see a slowdown, but I don't think we see a complete rollback. We should, however, consider it as a warning sign.
Thanks. Let me perhaps try to make 3 points that haven't been made yet. First, I think the biggest impact currently people see, not me only, in the non-climate sustainability agenda. So protection of biodiversity. Chemicals regulation has already been postponed by the Commission, was planned for the last term. Anything to do with what I would also stress, climate policy integration, greening agriculture. I think these are the areas where currently the prospects are much less good than on climate. Most people seem to be on board with climate kind of the core of the plan, but not the broad agenda. So the broad agenda will likely suffer. Second point is a lot of it will now be about implementation. I already mentioned that all this legislation, grant packages, but it needs to be implemented. And there, the politics will also play a role to what extent people will actually go there. And also the Commission will go after member states and also other actors who are not fully implementing. So that's a space to be watched. And finally, as a social scientist, political scientist, I'm also paying a lot of attention to these elections. But I think as important are the broader societal dynamics and the broader momentum. The EPP was very progressive because society seemed to be very progressive in the last term. Now they seem to be less progressive because society seems to be less progressive. If there is again a movement that supports this beyond the parliament, then I wouldn't be that much concerned. Then we will move forward with the majorities that we have, and perhaps even with the conservatives on that. But so a lot depends not only on the outcome of the election, but also what's going on in between. Thanks.
Thank you. I would say that the reality of climate policy is based on two pillars. And those two pillars are mitigation from one side and adaptation or strengthening of the carbon sink systems on the other side. This is the reason why in 1992, at the summit of Rio, three different conventions were started. One is the Convention on Climate, which is the UNFCCC. The other one is the one on biodiversity. The third one is on desertification. What has happened over the last more than 30 years is that the objectives were put off continuously until 2018, 2019. The reason why there was this system change, which was started with a unilateral declaration by the European Union with the Green Deal, is just that we have come to a point where some choices are unavoidable. And there is also another element, which is the industrial development. Is a business case for the mitigation part is right, because nowadays electricity produced from renewables is the cheapest energy ever produced in the world, ever. It is much more convenient to produce electricity from renewables, especially solar photovoltaic, than any other form of fossil. It's displacing coal, even in countries such as China. China has achieved 40% of its growth in GDP last year in the new sectors of renewables, batteries, grids, ultra-high voltage grids, and hydrogen applications in terms of electrolyzers. What does it mean? It means that the industrial revolution that we are facing is already on course. And we, as Europeans, are dependent on electricity, on energy imports. We are over 80, we were before the war, about 80% dependent on exports, on imports from energy from outside the bloc. That means that we are in the weakest situation for industrial competitivity. The only solution ahead is the build-up of renewables, which is exactly why, after the war has started in Ukraine, the reaction of the European Commission has been to increase, double down on renewables with EU Repower. It also means that sticking to fossil infrastructure will mean that our cost for production will be not competitive. We are seeing this already within the European member states. Companies are moving up to the north because in the Baltics there is a build-up of wind production. Companies are moving from the south of Germany to the north of Germany, from the southwest of Germany to the eastern part where there is wind production. The same is happening for Italy. Now, the projects and the references to the enabling infrastructure and technologies that are necessary for the implementation of the Green Deal, the lady,
Flora was mentioning are already covered by something which is called projects of common interest, that are projects cross borders. And the most important technology for the realization and the implementation of a renewable powered system is electricity grids. And we are building them now. Last but not least, the competitiveness of Europe is put at risk by the dependency on a US LNG that we started buying in quantities, in large quantity. And this is, from a climate point of view, because of methane leaks, the worst fossil gas you can find. It's much better to buy from Russia from a climate perspective. And the United States have started a commercial trade, competitivity, confrontational, competitive action with the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is aimed to attract investments also from our companies. This is the risk that we are facing, and leaving the mitigation side, the industrial conversion, which we are in need for being able to remain on the world stage as a competitive entity, would be suicidal. And that's why all these parties are not going to go back on that one. Regarding the mitigation, the adaptation part and the carbon sinks, we are facing again risks. The European Central Bank has highlighted in a recent report that 74% of SMEs and companies in general in Europe depend on ecosystem services for production. What does it mean? Very simple. If you do not have water, you do not produce energy, you do not produce food. That's it. Drought has increased 29% in 15 years in the Mediterranean, and we're already seeing a depletion of the productivity of several agricultural producers, 30% minus, for instance, olive oil. This is where we are, and the costs are becoming very, very high and very impactful. We're around 44 billion euros in 2022, 45 billion euros for remediation, facing the impacts of the catastrophes in 2023, and it's going to be higher. Again, also on the agricultural sector, look at China. They started a new green revolution, working on innovation, for instance, on new molecules for the production of soil of different feedstock. And they are working on the cleaning up of those soils, and they're talking about putting tariffs on our meat as a reaction to the very, let's say, not particularly smart decision of imposing tariffs on electric vehicles. Based on what? On environmental criteria. Because meat produced in the European Union is extremely heavily intensive in energy, in fossil, and in pollutants. So this is where we are. The CBAM will be not our defense, but will be the way the Chinese are going to get to increase the exports into Europe. Either we clean it up or we are out.
Thank you all for your intervention. I had a list of questions that we had prepared, but after this intervention, maybe I would like to switch it a little bit. One question that I'm personally wondering is, starting from what you said, Sebastian, that eventually the way the EPP is going to conduct itself depends on the rest of the society. But if I take it back to the politics and the result of the election, what we don't know yet is whether the alliance is going to be rather towards the right or towards the left, and that might actually influence a lot of things. And so what I want to ask you, Arvea, is, at least in France and more globally, the far right is massively opposed to renewable energy as a principle, as a project of society. So I don't know, you don't necessarily want to talk about politics, but I want to ask you if you are at all afraid that if the EPP were to do a coalition with the far right, then all of our objectives in terms of renewable energy development could be jeopardized.
I was trying to make the point that is, and I actually wrote an article which is going to appear tomorrow for an Italian daily. I gave an interview yesterday, and another one is appearing on the second largest news agency in Italy. This is not a space where party politics is going to have that much space for weakling, because there are a number of constraints, including the industrial process which has been set in motion, and there are a number of constraints that are set by nature. You cannot negotiate with the increase of catastrophic events that are already. There is a drought in Sicily nowadays. There is a drought in Sicily, and animals are dying. Okay, so this is the first point when you're talking to farmers. And I'm working with an association. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm working with an association of 30,000 Italian butchers. Okay, so these people were probably not what you would consider the most ecologically minded people. They're businesses and they're selling meat. They understood, and it's taken some time to work with them, with some colleagues, that there were physical constraints and there were dependencies on the marginalities, cost structures, which is set by the, so to say, industrial system for breeding animals. You got large breeders that are the most impactful, both in terms of GHG and in terms of ammonia, in terms of alteration of nitrogen cycles. This is it. And then you got diversified, regionally dispersed, smaller breeders that have got normally between 50 to 150 heads of livestock. Now, the 30,000 Italian butchers that are differentiating themselves from the large distributors, let's name one of the supermarket chains, has decided to go to the Ministry of Agriculture. We organized an event in Milano. We invited the minister who was from the Meloni party. The title of the event was something about the new molecules for meat, synthetic meat. The Italian government is so opposed to that that they even legislated against it without even having something on the market. Okay, so they're against, for instance, the novel protein legislation in Europe. And we put a proposal forward for our 30,000 butchers to put a small chain, short and close production of meat throughout increasing protocols that are already implemented at European level, not only for animal welfare, but also for biodiversity. Why? Because many studies, and if you look at the GRC, you will see there is a case of they're introducing bisons in Romania, for instance. Smaller herds that move around are good for the soil, enrich the soil, increase and protect the biodiversity. And this is one of the ways that you can talk to them. To make a general point, and then I will go on. The agriculture system is very diversified. The representations that are being very vocal are basically the large producers. And those operate according to methods that are industrial methods. There is a connection with the banking sector.
I'm sorry to cut you off because we have a lot to cover.
No, sure. We have to talk to the small ones and start changing the way. And there is a question of politics in giving the right price signals. Because the Green Deal is only about giving a price to resources and changing the subsidy structures. That's all behind every one of the 85 pieces of legislation out there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be jumping to quite a different topic because it's something that we thought would be important to mention. And this question is going to be for you, Andrea, to start. And it's about green growth and degrowth, and it's coming from an increasingly large voice that we can hear in the background that is so far completely unheard, at least at the European institutional level, which is, do we need to completely change our economic system? is it actually possible to decouple GDP growth from greenhouse gas emissions? But also in a period of very high inflation and increasing poverty, is it still relevant to talk about degrowth?
Yes, thank you, Paul. So maybe also just to say, I'm here from an organization that is called Solidar, which is a civil society organization. So we are an NGO, actually a European network of NGOs which are scattered a bit all over Europe. And degrowth, yes. I mean, I guess everybody's familiar with the concept of degrowth, which actually has gone a bit more from the margins of the public or the political debate, let's say, to more the center in the last few years. Now, seeing how elections went and how things are most likely going to go in the European Parliament, and of course then setting also then the agenda for the Commission, etc., it might no longer be the case then in the next few years. So maybe degrowth won't be as popular as it was, because it was quite popular, at least among progressive these past few years. Last year, there was this big conference on beyond growth, with several MEPs from several groups actually supporting and organizing the conference. So, I mean, what we say, so in my organization, in Solidar, is that we need to promote economic models which are putting, planet and people over profit. So which are these economic models? I mean, of course, we talk about the circular economy, but we also work on something which is called, and I don't know if many are familiar with it, the social economy or the social and solidarity economy. Cooperatives, so a model which really, doesn't have profit as the main goal, but as, the well-being of people, and of course also, the well-being of environment and climate at the very center. So in Solidar, we don't necessarily talk a lot about degrowth. Why? Because it's also true that while it's become quite popular, there are still a few people and decision makers who are quite against the idea of degrowth. And I think very often people also have this, they misjudge the concept by thinking that everyone is saying that everything has to degrow, while, for example, in the concept of degrowth, public services, essential public services need to grow. They don't have to degrow. So I think that's where there's also a lot of misinformation about what degrowth means. But we don't use it in Solidar. We talk about a well-being economy. And in the well-being economy framework, then you have indicators that can be used to measure the well-being of a country, which are beyond, income and jobs. So, for example, work-life balance or the health of people. So there are lots of also interesting research on how to measure other indicators of well-being beyond GDP. And we support very much then using these indicators.
Thank you. I forgot to mention that all the questions are meant to be conversation starters, and that if the rest of the panelists would like to add something to what has just been said, please just raise your hand or take the floor if you would want to. and otherwise, keep it under two. But we'll have to keep it short, yeah. But just like coming back to what you were saying at the beginning, then thank you for explaining a bit more what degrowth means or well-being economy. Are you worried with this new election and this new parliament? Do you expect a shift away from these kind of concerns?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. What in civil society and of course with other organizations, and I guess also with the in trade unions, for example, there's a lot of talk of us also having to adapt our narrative or the way we talk about the things we want. So, for example, my organization stands for social justice and solidarity and more equality. And now, everybody sort of urges us to connect our, objectives with the hot topics of the moment. So competitiveness, industrial policy, but also security and defense. I personally don't agree. I think we should still stick with what we stand for. And of course, topics such as climate will be more mainstreamed, maybe will not be at the forefront of policy making, will maybe mainstreamed in wherever we come, an industrial deal, etc. But there's still a way for us also civil society to use our arguments without changing them or without subterfuge, I don't know how to say it in English, ways to pass our messages. I think we can still stand proud. Of course, it's just that maybe the listening here, the person that on the other side who will listen to us, maybe will be less receptive of things like degrowth.
Yes, Laura.
Yeah, maybe to add to the degrowth question and whether with the slight shift to the right, it's going to be harder to add degrowth elements or just generally bring this topic to the forefront of politics. We've actually been doing a bit of an assessment of like degrowth and sufficiency elements that are already existent in the European climate policy, European Green Deal, Fit for 55 packages, and actually in concrete legislations, we don't have that much that goes into that direction so far. We've had with the energy crisis coming from the war between Russia and Ukraine, we did have a call to save energy. This was the main thing we could find on sufficiency aspects that exists. And as Sebastian said, the European Green Deal is a growth strategy. It says that very specifically. So currently in the political area, I think degrowth is a bit shunned. Nobody really wants to talk about it specifically. So I feel like any sufficiency element that would come into a policy mix would probably not be labeled with degrowth. It would come in other forms. Like I think in the ideas for degrowth for sufficiency, just to give a very concrete example, cycling infrastructure is, I think, one part of that to get concrete. And if you don't label this as degrowth, but more for well-being, for health aspects, etc., for climate aspects, obviously, I think there are ways to maybe not on a European level, because cycling infrastructure is rather local, I would say, or at least regional. There are ways to put these ideas into practice, also kind of more from bottom up rather from the top down EU level. But yeah, that's what I can add.
Irene, I'll give you the last word, but just in a minute, please.
We all want to say, and I think was actually just reinforcing that there are elements on the agenda, I think, that can be used, don't need to be used by civil society, but by policymakers. Strategic autonomy, etc., circular economy, resource efficiency, which build on stuff, bring elements in enabling community initiatives, can also happen from the European level, that lets the elements grow without necessarily, degrowth or even sufficiency as concepts making them dominant. Yeah, thanks.
And then we have 30 seconds. Okay, well, so this ties in very well, actually. There have been a few comments about the way we shape the message, and this actually is going to be our next themes. Stefano is going to ask you questions about communication.
Yeah. So to give just a little bit of background, as a job, I'm a scientific communicator, and on a daily basis, analyze the communication style of the Commission to see if it's actually effective, and it's not. So I brought down some of the things that you say regarding the European Green Deal, a growth strategy. Sebastian say hundreds of pages of legislation. Flora, regarding his own project, say we should include inclusiveness and information. And well, the main point is that the communication coming, I can say from the Commission, but I can take in this case the case of the European Green Deal. It's based on a crisis-driven narrative. It doesn't use that well social media. It's complex, it's full of jargon. All these factors, in my opinion, are quite important that should be considered and should certainly influence also the results of the election. So I take just a quote from Joanna Kaminska, that it's a EU election candidate for the Polish Greens, that criticized the EU executive for withdrawing many of the planned regulation regarding the European Green Deal, calling it a bad thing for all Europeans. I find it the biggest mistake by the Commission that it failed in the area of communication of what the Green Deal is and the inclusion of all stakeholders, like farmers and consumer in the consultation. So my first question, and I will start with Stephanie, how can the European Commission enhance its communication strategy to better emphasize the socio-economic advantages of the Green Deal, particularly for vulnerable groups such as farmers and consumers?
I think that the European Commission can do a few things to better its communication strategy. First of all, it's talking about and promoting success stories. People need to be able to relate to actual people, not only to bureaucrats here in Brussels that feels like a really niche group and no one really knows what is happening in its world, because there are success stories as well. The problem is we need to see them, and everyday people need to see them as well. A second part is targeted messaging. I think they need to tailor communications to address specific concerns and the interests of different vulnerable groups, and using, of course, relatable language and local examples. We cannot use jargon. Not everyone is used to what we're used here. And I think this also applies to the intergenerational panorama across the EU. We need to cater to different ages. A person that is 19 years old or 16, because a few 4 member states have 16-year-old voters, is not going to understand and use the same jargon to talk about politics that someone that is 50, which is 55 is the average age of people working in the EU, for example. And that leads us to multi-channel approaches, because we need to use different communication channels, including different social media, but also local media, community meetings, workshops, to reach a wider audience. I think everyone living here in Brussels tends to use, for example, Politico quite religiously. I at least do every day. But people living in the north of Spain in a small village, they're not reading Politico. They're reading their national newspaper, which has even a bigger benefit, and more people read that than Politico. So we need to make that information kind of reach there as well, or even on TikTok. That's why the new candidate, the French candidate, Bardella, yeah, he's so famous. He has millions of followers on TikTok. And it's very strategic to these new voters that actually are poised to vote for him and, well, voted for the far right in France, in Germany, and so on and so forth. And that leads me also to, through engagement and participation, we need to foster meaningful dialogue with stakeholders, not just say that we're going to do so. And I think an example of a failure of doing so was has been with the recent strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture, because up until January, we didn't know how this dialogue was gonna be, what was gonna happen. And they have been announcing this since last year. So is it meaningful? Who were these few handpicked people to be in the room? Mm-hmm. Also the youth that were there, for example, rural youth, when we were talking about inclusion. So yeah, I think that's a little bit of stronger lens.
Thanks a lot. There's anyone else who wants to add something?
Yeah, maybe very quickly. There's a lot of very interesting information out there, publications, research done by a lot of also civil society organizations. This CAN Europe, Climate Action Network Europe, and the European Environmental Bureau on also how to speak about climate action. I mean, of course, from, I think it's useful for the European Commission, but not necessarily just, I think also for activists or for ourselves in civil society. And I think a lot is also very interestingly about the benefits, the socioeconomic benefits of climate action. Unfortunately, it seems that telling a person that, their kids will die because the planet will be burning doesn't work anymore, or I don't know if it's ever worked, I mean, maybe yes. But for many, it seems such a distant and intangible thing that telling them will not make them vote or support necessarily climate policies. While, for example, connecting, action that is good for the planet, but also helps with the cost of living crisis, with the fact that the energy bills are very high, with the fact that inflation is so high and so on. Apparently that helps also with short-term benefits and tangible things for people that helps get them their support for climate action. I don't think it's necessarily, the best thing ever, but if this is what we're supposed to be doing to make also climate action advance, let's also connect with these benefits.
Yeah, adding to that, I always think back to one example from Germany where our now finance minister, as a reaction to Russia's invasion to Ukraine and the rising energy prices, was rather suddenly very much pro renewable energies. I mean, not very suddenly, but our Liberal Party is not too green, so to say. And he used the word of Freiheitsenergien, freedom energies. And I think this creates a very positive narrative. And it ticks so many boxes. It ticks the climate box. We become resilient. We are free. We are like the Liberal Party. We're independent from Russia. And this created a very positive narrative. And it caught fire, so to say, quite fast. And many people were like, oh, we need renewable energy. And basically within a day, the Liberals totally turned climate matters and renewable energy into their hot topic. They kind of forgot about it again, but I think this is a good example of how you can kind of create a bit of traction with one positive connotative word that is used well and then advertised well. I think it's very interesting to see the dynamic around that.
I have to be brief, right? So anyway, I've heard complaints about how the Commission communicates for a number of decades. Despite all good intentions, I think that all new people have had to change that. So there must be something structural. And I think something structural is that we equate the Commission with the EU, and that we ourselves somehow seem to think that up from there will come the solution also in terms of communication. The EU is more than the Commission. It's all of us. It's the member states. It's always complaining about Brussels and then saying it's the Commission. It's just wrong. We need to invest in education, that people actually understand what the EU is and how it works. And that the EU is not the Commission.
Yes.
So that would be my response to getting the communication right.
Arvea, do you have something to add?
But I see a problem with the Commission itself communicating for a very simple reason. In an ideal world, and I would be a very staunch supporter of a very technocratic Commission, that would be a body which makes proposals for policies, evidence, and science-based. What happens is that the commission between the political level of the commissioners themselves, the Commission as a body, and the dynamics with the member states are making it impossible for the technocrats themselves. I know many Commission people who would be just like very appalled and willing to answer on social media, but that's not their roles. And it's actually this silence that protects you, the people who work at the Commission, behind closed doors to be able to put forward these full proposals, and I hope technical competence will be even stronger. Because if the Commission sets to start defending what it looks like policies, then the Commission loses their only left form of recognition and authority at European level. So that is a bit of a risk. The problem is another one, that we need, you were asking before why I don't believe that there will be much to change. The Council yesterday, he approved 3 pieces of legislation, not only the nature restoration law. Yes, I know the nature restoration law, we've got a lot of problems, but there was the soil health monitoring, which is not position. There were positions on waste reduction, some part of the eco-design. It is, whatever you call it. I don't call it degrowth. I don't like the word degrowth. I call it lean practices and extreme efficiency, enhancing efficiency. Reducing consumption of resources is making us freer. Renewable energy allows for us not to have to pay for energy when we are in energy communities in Sweden. The problem with the bankability of renewables is that it doesn't pay because the CapEx model implies that you got operating costs. Renewable energies are free energy for all, or I'm exaggerating, nothing is free completely. But this is the narrative that cannot be taken to the public if we want to keep the system that funds the fund systems. That's point on communication. It is partly up to us, but we also have to have the political parties taking up for the responsibility. I see political decision makers in the UNFCCC, for instance, process, when they have to be told the truth and tell the truth. There is no place posturing there. This is what happens here all the time.
Thanks a lot. For the sake of time, I think that I will move to the next topic. And I think, well, it was mentioned in the previous answers, but we'll talk about agriculture. So the recent wave of farmer protests across Europe has brought significant attention to the CAP, to the common agriculture policies. And of course, with an intersection with the European Green Deal. So the CAP originally was designed to secure stable incomes for farmers, ensure food security, and now this is a really big dual challenge of integrating rigorous environmental standards while supporting farmers economically. This balancing act has brought the role of powerful agricultural lobbying into sharp focus. So the main focus that I want to analyze with few questions or one question depending on the time, it's that agriculture is one of the major sources of these emissions. And with this election and with the entire European Green Deal being under threat, and this is something that we can continue to talk about, I would like to ask first to Flora, how can the CAP be reformed to better balance environmental sustainability and economic viability for farmers? And additionally, how should the European Union communicate this change of these possible reforms?
You've got the wrong person. No, I'm definitely not an expert in agriculture, so I won't go too far on this, and maybe because the other people who have a bit more expertise in that area. What I can say is what I've said before, agriculture and climate policies are not integrated enough. We have the different pillars in the CAP, and I mean, there were attempts, let's say, to make the CAP, to design it in a more environmentally friendly way that it supports sustainability in agriculture better. I think you in Brussels specifically saw that that didn't go too well. It was quite a tough process, and that it was then actually taken back and rolled back. So I think here with agriculture, we definitely have to think about the inclusiveness element. I'm not sure if you can say more about that, Stephanie. But I think this is as far as my expertise goes. Maybe I can hand over.
Yeah, if someone else wants to add something, otherwise I already. Okay, yeah, please.
Yeah, I think to complement what you said, we have a problem with the current CAP, and we see that 80% of the funds went to 20% of the farmers. And there was a green architecture in the current CAP, which has been consistently stripped down, especially and more consistently so ever since this farmer protests started. So there was something there. It was not ideal, but now it's being rolled back, it's being delayed, so I think we're going to see how that's going to be changed. I think we saw with these protests all over Europe how lobbying works. It just worked for something, unfortunately, that is not climate friendly. But I think that can also gives us hope that we lobbying pro with climate and the environment can maybe put that back. But I think we need to do that together with farmers and together with people. That's the issue. We cannot decide here and just let it be, because they see the effects in their current lives. And I think that has been the issue and the disconnection between, okay, what is happening in Brussels, what is happening at the top levels, and what happens there. So I think a better dialogue needs to be installed. I don't know if the strategic dialogue will come up with a solution. It might. Let's see.
Any?
Perhaps just to reinforce, I think we have again an area where we are complaining for decades that the CAP doesn't get green. And I think part of the problem is what was just said, there is an enormous distance, obviously, a highly integrated European policy framework and then the farmer on the field, right? And there's an enormous distance. And somehow we need probably not only this one strategic dialogue that is, I think, to be concluded this year, but more communication channels where actually one can work with the farmers and not also all kinds of intermediaries where there are also industrial interests, etc., but really work out a solution for moving forward. Because what we also see is this, I don't know whether you also see this, on the one side, let's strip down all these environmental requirements. And on the other side, with each and every flood and drought, give us more subsidies because we need to deal with this. This is obviously, at least for me as an academic, what? This doesn't go together well. So, but there must be a way of having more dialogue across these levels and moving forward and really with concrete measures when farmers are also with the policy making.
And that's why I was talking about the action that we're taking, or I was taking, for instance, as technical director until December of a foundation which is constituted by 19 businesses. The chair is an agriculture entrepreneur, Andrea Illi, the coffee manufacturer. There was Mutti, which is also the tomato producer in Italy. So very practically, the CAP is about 55 billion euros a year, 43% of the budget of the European Union. And obviously, there was a question of how rebalancing the subsidies, the price signals I was mentioning, that's the policy decision, and there were green conditionalities. There are still some. The green conditionalities is the instrument that we take when we go to our partners on the ground, because you have to model businesses. You can model businesses, for instance, as the Commission is starting doing with another piece of legislation, well, a proposal at the moment, which is the carbon farming system. The carbon farming is going to be the piece missing, the piece of legislation that will allow the constitution of a Fit for 55 for the agriculture sector, for the LULUCF is called under UNFCCC system, land use and land management and forestry. Why is that? Because you remember I was telling you the two pillars of climate policy. If you you mitigate, you cut emissions. If you strengthen the sinks, you allow for the sinks that are nature ecosystems, oceans, land, to be able to work with you to diminish and decrease the amount of GHG, and has a lot of other effects, because from nature you got the tackling of all the elements that are being referred to as the nature pillar of the Green Deal. Chemicals, FAS, for other chemicals, pollutants, nitrogen cycles, phosphorus cycles, land protection. So how do you do that? In the moment in which you've got a way for having farmers to be paid for working in harmony with nature, to strengthen nature, that is carbon capture, and this is going to be a sort of a credit, then you will be able to start paying them for for utilizing their soils in a different way. And this is what we are doing with these 30,000 butchers. We're talking to the small breeders, and we're telling the breeders you're going to be paid more because you're going to provide through a protocol a product. I'm sorry, as I said, as a vegetarian, it's not nice to talk of a product if you talk of an animal, but meat that is going to be sold at a premium price. Another thing is like the distribution of margin along the supply chain. Mutti, for instance, is paying 15 to 20% more its producers, tomato producers in Italy, short chain. Why? Because they do it in a vertical integration way. You do not have the brokers. A lot of the money along the CAP, this is the Italian way, the Common Agriculture Policy, goes to basically distributors. A lot of it is inputs in fertilizers, and fertilizers, surprise, surprise, is gas. So independency, for instance, on food inflation After Ukraine, increase of fertilizers costs, another topic for autonomy. And if you say that and you connect to food inflation, for instance, and this is going to increase a lot, you will see a lot of the representatives, and I've seen them around the tables, of farmers' organizations that are present in Brussels to get very irked and to immediately react saying, no, this is energy, and then you go down and you explain, yeah, that's fertilizers. And you know what, when you talk about innovation, well, the EIC, the European Innovation Council, funded some time ago a company that had already been funded under Horizon. They have got a system for producing nitrogen fertilizers with direct capture from the air and conversion through photosynthesis. This is a completely scalable, market-ready system that they're trying to sell to some of the large producers. They don't, because you're displacing their supply chains exactly in their production methods. I'm not going to name and shame that particular producer. So this is really availability of price signals and decisions very clearly about what can and cannot be done.
Thanks a lot. I will ask the last question that is actually related to what you said. So first of all, my first question is, any person present in this room has watched the movie or the documentary Food for Profit? Okay, so it's a documentary that presents a specific, it's a critique about the intensive farming system that was implemented in Europe. It attacks directly also the CAP and present the strong detachment that there is between institution and the farmers and so on. And particularly there is a strong focus on one element, the agricultural lobbying. So I wanted to ask, we heard different perspectives regarding that. What do you think should be the role of agricultural lobbies groups in shaping the EU agriculture and environmental policies? Because at the moment, they have a strong influence. Even when I was working in agri, all the decisions were strongly influenced by lobbies. So there was science, there were policies, and then there was something else that wasn't said, but was always there. So how can the policy-making process become more inclusive of small-scale and ecological farmer interests, always considering what I say, the lobbies? Whoever wants, it's a free floor. Silence is also an answer.
Let me try to have a start. I think it has to do with what we said before of establishing different channels, or what I said before, establishing different channels of communication, because a lot of the communication is mediated by these lobbyists. What we know from political science is obviously that bigger actors find it easier to organize. So the big farmers find it easier to organize. Big industry finds it easier to organize than the small organic farmers somewhere, where it's more, you can obviously address that by supporting that organization in some way, to have their voice heard or to invite them, etc. Politically, that may face certain obstacles because it then enables the other lobbyists. And again, as I said, I mean, it's fascinating also from a political science perspective to see how these lobbies over decades have succeeded in protecting that bit of European policymaking. So that is certainly not an easy question that you're asking how to change that. But I think the general recipes are clear whether you can implement them against the opposition and resistance. That's the question. So there I don't have a good answer.
It's an answer. It's already a lot. There is someone else that wants to add something?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to highlight the unfairness of the role. I mean, when you look, for example, at who goes to COP and, the fossil fuel industry bringing hundreds of lobbyists and then activists, obviously with society struggling even to go, particularly if it's in Dubai, etc. I mean, it's not so different also at European level. Of course, we all have different channels, But when it comes to civil society organizations like YE or Solidar, where our funding is extremely limited, very often we're based on projects, annual projects, so we don't know if next year will even exist. And then you have big industries with offices in Brussels of lobbyists who are only paid to do the advocacy part and to go speak with people while we struggle because we got some commission funding to run a project, do some research, etc. I mean, it's completely different worlds, unfortunately. So that's where, from our side, from society, we do our best. But yeah, the power of the lobby is extremely different.
I think building upon what you said, I think a way to kind of hinder that power dynamic or imbalance is to carve out institutional space, that you have these people there that are most vulnerable, for example, smallholders, you need to have them at the table. That happens with youth, for example, because, well, the youth has this youth dialogue that they're trying ever more to kind of implement or bring us to the decision-making table meaningfully and continuously. So I think that would be a way, because as everyone has said, farmers have been there and they will be there. Lobbyists, they have been there and they will be there. But I think if you have a seat at the table for these kind of people, then you at least have them there, and it can kind of hinder. And then you also put financing means, and you target financial support to kind of make sure that these voices are heard. Because
So yes, of course, and
No, I know I don't mention that. I think maybe one more thing I would actually, all this is the idea of transparency, because I generally think that actually lobbying is shouldn't be a bad word, and it's part of a perfectly healthy democratic process, and it's perfectly normal for decision makers to take advice and to hear everyone. So one idea would be to ensure that every piece of legislation has attached all of the decision process and everyone who's contributed to that, and then it would make it a bit more transparent and visible whether that group tends to be every decision, and if it's like their representation of different civil society organizations. Okay. Well, yeah. From one microphone to another. We'll try to finish fast because I want to keep some time for questions afterwards. The last theme that we have in mind is about social justice. And I will direct my first question to Andrea because it is your field of expertise. There are already mechanisms within the European Union that are tailored and made to ensure a just transition, to ensure that vulnerable people and territories are not overly affected by green policies. And these are the Climate Social Fund and the Just Transition Mechanism. I don't think that these are very famous part of the EU, and yet very important. So I just wanted to start with asking you if you could just quickly explain what these are and give your opinion, again, since we are post-election, if they're going to be affected at all by the recent election.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yes, indeed. So this is my field of expertise, not at all agriculture. So I maybe won't speak an hour about this, so we don't have 1 hour, but it's really interesting stuff. So if you're interested, also don't hesitate to ask me later. So indeed, so the social justice element in the European Green Deal, Sebastian, you mentioned the leave no one behind principle. Now, how did the European Commission put that into practice? Well, we say not very well. The approach to social justice or the fairness of the green transition of the European Commission has mainly been we're doing something that will potentially have an impact on the most vulnerable, on people in poverty, on people experiencing inequalities, because of course it's not just income inequalities, but it's also inequalities based on gender and race and so on. So the approach has been that our policies might have an impact. Let's do something to compensate that impact. And normally the compensation is money. What we say is that that's not the right approach. We say that you need a proactive social approach and a progressive one, in the sense that you need strong social policies. And very often the instruments have also been very different, meaning sometimes, there's a regulation and the social initiative or the social way of tackling it has been a recommendation. So of course, also the tools have been very different. But yes, so the main social element in the European Green Deal are indeed the two funds. So one is the Social Climate Fund, which is actually not even on yet. It's starting in 2026. It's going to be something around 65 million euros. And it's money that's going to go to the member states, and the member states are going to decide how to redirect it towards, first of all, investment. So investment in people, let's say, or in things for people, but also there's going to be money directly going to the most vulnerable. So money that should end up in the to mitigate, for example, the energy bill of the most vulnerable. Now, 65 million is nothing, but also this process means that the member states will have to develop so-called social climate plans to say how this money is going to be redistributed. The social climate plans are due in less than 1 year, and apparently no member state has even started working on them. So there's a big danger that this money will not even go to the right people, and governments like mine in Italy might even just decide to do whatever they want with the money. And then there's the Just Transition Fund, which is a fund that is already on. This one, it's money that's directed to regions, so not regions in terms of landers, but cities or small localities all over Europe to help decarbonize certain sectors, so coal mines, but also cement, steel, some of these polluting sectors in a fair way, meaning through providing, for example, reskilling opportunities for the workers, those that are losing job. That's 84 million euros over 5 years. It's also, peanuts. I mean, it's gonna help some regions, but if we want to decarbonize all over Europe, all of Europe in a fair way, that's really nothing. Which is why in Solidar we call for a green and social deal as the follow-up to the Green Deal, a strategy that has a much stronger social dimension. And of course, these funds will play a role, but there need to be a lot of things fixed also in the way these funds are handled, and the amounts are also way too little.
Sebastian, go ahead.
Sorry. Just a couple of remarks. I think I heard you say millions, but I think you meant billions, right?
Yes.
Which may still not be enough, but slight difference. I think it may be good to understand that obviously the competence of the EU in social policy is very limited under the treaties. Therefore, you definitely need to always keep in mind the member states. That is actually why all these funds are actually then also structured so that there are national plans submitted by member states, and then the reimbursement goes accordingly. But it's, I think, very important to realize that, to then have the right recipes on how to go further, and to have a broad understanding of justice. I think that you also advocated, that's not only about money. So what can the EU do? A lot is money, because money is coming from these emissions trading systems, and then you can use it, etc. But policy making, real social policy making, is much more difficult, because that would have to cannot be passed in normal legislative procedure. So that needs to involve the member states also when we think about then more participatory recognition of justice elements, etc., that need to be part, not only money, here you have the money, but good involve people. Thanks, I thought that might be useful.
Thank you, Sebastian. And this actually kind of ties with the kind of concluding questions I wanted to ask, and it's for whoever, maybe Stephanie, if you want to start and then pass it along. And it's more globally whether you have any advice on what priority measures should be taken in order to make sure that the implementation of future green policies will not be continued to be felt as a burden on our most vulnerable citizens, households, and regions, because so far that is very much how it's felt.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief because I'm going to echo what you just said about the European Green and Social Deal. I was actually going to talk about the European Pact for the Future, which was something that the EB also just recently launched, and we, YE as an organization, also signed, and individuals and other organizations can also sign. And that's what they call for a just transition, where you create opportunities and ensures, of course, that all citizens benefit from this sustainable progress. So basically, yeah, an European Green and Social Deal. I think something very important as well, it just adding to what we spoke, is also having into account that these inequalities are also intergenerational. And for example, when it comes to youth, youth has not been involved, for example, in the just transition mechanism, or very little. And for example, a youth-led organization that also works in environment, Generation Climate Europe, they surveyed all of the just transition mechanism plans, and they found that youth was not included at all in some countries or very little included. So we need to, as I said before, to meaningfully engage stakeholders and make sure they are at the table, because who better to understand your problems than, well, yourself, and to make sure that the money that is going around, even though it's not a lot, goes there. And I think YE, for example, does that quite nicely. We have a project called EU Teams for Greens, which just recently concluded, for example, and it was launched in all of the just transition mechanism regions across the EU. And it was basically sub-granting, so giving money to really young groups, so people from 14 until 24, that were doing social justice projects in their regions. So I think that's how you kind of empower and make sure that people have agency and feel that the projects are theirs.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, he was right. Changing perception at citizens level is almost impossible if you're thinking you can do that from Brussels, because policies are made at state level. So from my experience working with organizations and companies and associations of companies on the ground in a number of states, one thing that I see, and I also do that partly because I've got an agreement with the representation in Italy of the Commission under the TED, Team Europe Direct, is that very often this disconnect I was mentioning refers to capacities or competences around solutions that are provided as a possibility, at least, through Brussels. Then there is a question of how much capacity Brussels has itself, the Commission, in terms of human resources for really answering all these questions. For instance, talking about this project that you're setting up with the beachers, I'm thinking about relaying them. There's energy communities, okay? They're being launched in Italy. There has been we are in the implementation phase, and this is a strongly liberatory. This is really bringing freedom from cost of energy, creating stronger ties between stakeholders in a specific community. But people need knowledge transfer. How you do that, how you deal with the legislation, the new administrative procedures. This is something that you need to provide. The Ministry for Environmental Protection, the Ministry of Energy and Environment at the moment is doing some of it. But there are issues that can be dealt directly with in terms of general information. For instance, for the funding connections under LIFE projects, I know that there is a plethora of organizations on the ground for explaining, but they're disconnected from the companies. And another very powerful instrument that I'm discussing in different fora is the technical support instrument. This has done very good things, for instance, in Greece, in Romania. We're discussing for some options in Italy as well. And all these things should be put on a very easy catalog of ready to access, at least the focal point with the competent DJs for at least business associations. Because otherwise, the lobby in Brussels is only the lobbies that have got all the structure paid, the large offices, and the 50 people working here. That is an issue.
Andrea, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly. I'm not a big fan of the argument of EU competencies, because we've seen also in the past that that's not necessarily prevented the EU to do stuff, or like Next Generation EU. There are initiatives that aren't necessarily a new competence that happens. So when it comes to social policies, true, it's not a competence just of the European Union or an exclusive competence of the European Union, but there's still a lot that can be done. And that's why, for example, this idea of, the green and social deal, or, these eco-social policies where you're doing something, for example, on sustainability of food, then you also have to have measures in your proposal or in your legislative text on the affordability of food or on the quality of food and that's good for the health of people. And to answer your question about how to make sure that the implementation then of the Green Deal is also, not impacting the most vulnerable. That's, what we say is that we don't only need a green and social deal at EU level, and we also need similar strategies then at national level. Or, every city should ideally have their strategy for a just transition, or anyway, these eco-social policies and measures. And for example, just to conclude, I mean, again, also on the role of the European Union, there's a lot that the European Union can do to push member states to do stuff, for example, on just transition or more from the work side of the green transition and decent work. There's research that shows that only Spain is actually doing quite okay in terms of planning and having strategies for a just transition, while all other countries are lagging extremely behind. So is it okay to say, okay, this is the situation, we don't have to do anything? No, even if the competences are limited, there's a lot that can be done to make sure that things advance at national level and member states.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree. We tried to call cities in Italy for big buyers, which is a program of DG Grow on public procurement of innovation and that has federated for net zero construction sites. A number of cities. I've physically called people from Bologna, Roma, the smaller ones. They don't have the capacity. They say, I do not have the people, I don't speak English, we do not speak English. So this is not true. We need implementation at national level, and we need the capability at national level in their language.
I agree.
I think you go in the same direction. I think maybe eventually one of the issue is the way that the national power will eventually delegate some of this just transition initiatives towards regions and then even smaller local level. I know that in France right now there is a lot of questions on whether the national power is properly using all of the subsidiary bodies to go actually to the people. I'm really sorry, but I'm gonna have to close the part from our questions and try to also answer the one from the public that we've gotten from Slido. So I think we can put it up on the screen. So we're running about 15 minutes late, and we wanted to have half an hour for questions. So we'll take until 6:15.
My Zoom go? Did the Zoom stop? My Zoom is gone.
No, it's here. Yeah, you got it
Oh,
here.
wow.
There you go. Yeah. Right. Here. So this is going to be for whoever wants to take it first. And so they're rated on the most relevant one. So I'm going to go read the first one. How would you predict that the social dimension of the Green Deal will be developed during the next Commission's term? So this is something we've already kind of touched upon. Maybe we can dive a little deeper on basically what the European Commission can do again in trying to implement further social dimension of the Green Deal. If there is any policies or that should be focused on, in your opinion.
I guess that's for me, no? Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that can be done. If you ask trade unions, they're calling for a directive or for a new directive for a just transition of the world of work. There's organizations that are calling for a directive on sustainable resource management, which also has a strong and social dimension. So there are a lot of measures that can be done. Now, what will the Commission actually do? That's the big question mark. I can tell you the discussions we've been having now with the European Commission, but of course also we worked a lot with the Belgian presidency, for example, is that they do say that the social deficit or the social element will have a stronger role in whatever will come next. Then, if it's part of a broad EU industrial deal or of a EU competitiveness deal, if there's an action plan for what we call fair and just transition, then of course we will only discover when von der Leyen or whoever is president will present the political guidelines during the first plenary of the European Parliament on the 16th and 19th of July, sorry, and also when the work program of the Commission for 2025 will come out. Until then, we will not know for sure, but it does seem that the social dimension is something that will be more present than now. And I have to admit that it's not only thanks to us from civil society or social NGOs. Unfortunately, I would say it was also the farmers' protests brought the topic very much to the forefront because they were talking about, income for farmers. The far right has been campaigning for the EP elections on topics such as the cost of living crisis. Yeah, maybe things will be done on the social dimension also because of people we don't agree with. Now the question mark will also be exactly what will be done, because if we look at, for example, the social policies that the far right have done in Italy, if that's the kind of social policies or eco-social policies we'll have at EU level, then that's a big problem.
Does anyone else wish to come back on this?
Perhaps I was before talking about competence, and I realized that may sound as if you're not competent, you can't act. But it is, you need unanimity to act, and that's a high threshold. So but we've had the debate already that the member states need to be prominently involved there, and that's an important level of governance.
Coming back to the topic of communication, is the Green Deal having an issue with its name? And is the way of labeling it this way, isn't it sort of outdated and maybe a little too unrealistic or, too hopeful, and it doesn't sound serious enough? And should we actually kind of change the way we talk about this kind of legislative package to make it more concrete? Laura.
I would say maybe. I wouldn't say it's not technical enough or outdated in a sense. I think we still need green policy, climate policy. However, with the majorities that we see forming and with the opinion that seems to be out in society, I think we have a silent majority somewhere, but unfortunately it's silent. Maybe something like a competitiveness and resilience deal, or however you want to call it, but basically these themes are flying high right now with the conflict that we see around Europe, but also globally. And while I think we should consider aspects of degrowth and sufficiency with competitiveness and the European Green Deal as a growth strategy, climate policy can still be in those areas because we need to get competitive. As you said, our industries have to remain competitive in the areas of PV, the automotive industry, you say it's over already.
Gone. Photovoltaic is gone.
Photovoltaic is gone already, but I think the automotive industry, for example, is.
In fact, the manufacturers are entering joint ventures with the Chinese in order for, and with bringing the Chinese to work here, which is actually the most sensible thing to do, and to create manufacturing spaces here. I would like to make one very fast point, very quick point. Everyone is speaking about growth, degrowth, competitivity, whatever. The reality is that even before the strengthening of the NDC, the National Determined Contribution of Italy, last year before the global stocktake. And by the way, the Green Deal is nothing else if not the European nationally determined contribution. So the integration and the mainstreaming of climate and environmental policy is exactly what the plan is, and it is an industrial strategy. We can call it the program of the future, we can call it whatever we want, but that's it. Even that very not extremely ambitious NDC before the global stocktake in Italy very clearly said that in 2050, the number of vehicles, privately owned vehicles, that is cars, will be reduced by, and they gave a number of millions. I think it was very modest in the sense that the foreseen decrease in number of privately owned cars was less than what it's going to be actually. So fundamentally, a resource-efficient society and economy that uses less resources for the simple reason that the planet, we are consuming 100 billion tons physical resources every year. We cannot continue that. That's until we create with new molecules, which is one of the things we're trying to do with innovation for green chemistry, for food stock, for feedstock, for food and everything. Until we are limited and bound to what we have now, we are compelled to reduce the amount of resources that we are consuming. And in that sense, if you think of it, anything which is going to be an efficiency-driven industrial policy or economic policy, which means also the materialization of some of the products turning into services, this is already, I don't like the word I told you, I don't like it, but it's another form of economy that doesn't use the same amount and the same quantity of things. So I wouldn't really, we want to call it like with positive words, use positive words, but this is what is happening.
But if, because we've been talking a lot about renewable energy, and I genuinely wonder the way we are doing things right now and basically wanting to switch away from coal, but with renewable energy instead, the consumption of raw critical material that is going to implement is going to be enormous and will have the consequences.
Okay, first of all, given the what is the amount of electricity? Because we are talking about engineering processes, okay? We have to look at quantities and numbers. Europe in 2020, more or less, consumed 20,000 terawatt hour of all the electricity. Electricity today in energy consumption always makes up in every system for about 1/3, okay? Now, everybody says we have to switch 1-to-1. This is not the case for very simple reasons of, I'm making things very simple here, okay? Thermodynamics. Fossil energy systems are wasteful by design. The internal combustion engine, for instance, that we all have in our cars, except you driving an EV at the moment, in the highest efficiency situation, talking about the best thing, the best technology of the existing cars, has only an efficiency of 35%. That means that the rest is wasted. That is true for buildings, heatings, cooling. 70% of the energy that we use every day in the world is wasted, okay? When you talk to electrify things, and that's why electrification is the pathway, the main pathway towards a climate neutral and a decarbonized energy system, you're talking about a much higher efficiency in technical terms. For instance, what is the efficiency of an electric engine in a vehicle? You know that? Give me a number, anyone. We said that it's 35% for an engine in a an internal combustion engine. We're talking about minimum 80%. Realistically, a lot of it is 90%. So the amount of energy we have to go and replace is actually 1/3. of what we already spent. We have an issue today, and that is the real danger. Algorithms, artificial intelligence are exploding the electricity consumption. That is the risk, not what we already have.
Okay, I think there's a lot to say, and we can discuss it maybe afterwards. So because there is a question that I really actually want to ask, and it is linked to disinformation. And I think this already has been very present during the campaign before, and it has to do with the way that we present environmental legislation. It is very much instrumentalized by far-right movements. And so the question is, how do we systematically confront disinformation, which slows down, hinders, and stop efficient political response to climate change? So is there anything that we can do to
control the internet, control social media?
Yeah, so that we're going towards like dictatorship then, basically.
I don't want to, as I said, I'm not talking politics. I'm thinking in terms of engineering processes and how you govern transitions. You asked a question, I hear you an answer.
Okay, and politically speaking, what can we do to try to hinder this?
Schools, he was right, but you have to start very, very early, and we don't have that much time. So I don't think that we're going to have very educated masses of people.
Stefan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the problem of disinformation, it depends on who, because I think policymakers, people that need to know about climate change and have a power to actually change about it, they know the panorama. I think the problem of disinformation is more for the general public. I think about my parents and grandparents, even friends of mine that are not in the policy space or are not in this thing. But as we had a discussion after the elections, I think especially what you mentioned with the far right, they're willing to go to lengths that we are not with this populism. It's not about even the social media that they use, but how you communicate, like what you do, this kind of, I don't know, change. So I think there is, unfortunately, a systematic, how do you say, a barrier where it's really hard to kind of, say, let's not do, we're not going to do what they do, but we don't want to, that's why it's countered with education and with making people more aware of it. But yeah, it's a tough question because.
But if I start talking in concrete terms, for example, Meta has taken a very, very strong stance of completely stop advertising political content. So that is very, very extreme. But is this what we actually have to do in order to have a more like neutral public debate space?
How did you handle COVID?
Still.
How did we handle societally COVID? If we're talking about an existential crisis, the measures we have to probably assume, and this is also the sentences, the German Constitutional Court, Karlsruhe, 2019, forced the strengthening of the climate law in Germany, which had been passed by issuing a decision, a sentence, which was basically saying that if measures are not stronger now, the younger generations will be suffering in a non-proportional way, and therefore they will have to be enduring limitations of freedom. Politics or non-politics, physics, in the sense of things that happen, we cannot control. And those are boundaries for behaviors.
I'm going to move on to the next question, which is for you, Sebastian. Do the Commission plan on providing support, financial or institutional, to the Global South regarding the CBAM, and if not, through other green development projects? I think the question is, how do we make sure that the CBAM, the carbon border mechanism, adjustment mechanism, which is meant to create a level playing field between industries in Europe and outside, making sure that European industries are not overburdened by carbon credits. Obviously, for our partners outside and in the Global South, who are dependent on imports for their own economic growth. So is there any plans from the European Commission or European institutions to do anything to level the playing field with them and sort of like increase their capacity to decarbonize the industry so that they can keep importing things in Europe?
I think we're just at the beginning of the next legislative term, so it's really difficult to know what the plans might be and how they might be implemented, because that was part of the discussion on the CBAM, and there was no particular provision for providing that support in the CBAM discussion in the outcome. Perhaps to pinpoint a little bit more closely where the problem lies, right? The problem lies not with the resource-rich countries, relatively resource-rich countries, which are, in some of these products, major exporters to Europe. The problem is primarily the poorer countries, which sometimes actually, in European terms, account for a relatively small share of the European imports. But since they are small and poor countries, it's a relatively big share of their exports that is concerned. And I think there was perhaps not enough awareness that that is a problem. And hopefully that can be revisited to help them prepare for that situation and respond to that. And they may also not have the resources contrary to some other countries to then say, okay, I'll decarbonize my steel industry. Well, you know, for a poorer country, that might be a tough call, depending on who the owner is of that. If it's multinational companies that are producing there. So you see, it's a relatively complex issue in the end to look at. But at the moment, there are no appropriate means to addressing some of these tougher consequences that instrument may have for some of the poorer developing countries. If I can just say one thing also on the European Green Deal and whether that's a good term, I don't know, it's politics, right? So it's a nice term in a way because it combines all these elements, provides a vision, which is probably also why it's attacked. And then sometimes, as we know in politics, terms become terms that one can't use anymore because everybody just recently listened to a debate and a certain party always represented whenever there's something bad was in a discussion that it was in the background. So so then we talk about something else, but I think the issue is substantive, right? And in the end, there was also, I've also followed the international discussion. Kyoto Protocol at some point in the US became a non-word. Then we didn't use it anymore. At some point, the US also came and said, well, you know what you're talking about looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, moves like a duck. So there's a duck. So, I mean, they were also looking at the content of what was being discussed, not just the name.
Okay, I will close the discussion with this last questions. Isn't part of the Green Deal kind of a greenwashing? And because sometimes it promotes some products, policy or action that are aren't as environmentally friendly as they seem, such as hydrogen imports from Morocco. Hydrogen actually is a very, very good example where we label hydrogen as being the solution from everything, while 90 to 95% of it is made with gas or with fossil fuels. So Green Deal equals greenwashing so far?
Can I ask the person who's asked the question, where is he, to what provisions is he referring, he or she is referring specifically? No, it is important because it is thinking of
import of hydrogen from Morocco.
No, okay. Hydrogen from, again, is an engineering and standards and technical things, technical references. Hydrogen has a part in the transition as is not a fuel, it's a vector of energy for certain applications. One application is process industries. Those industries that require high temperature in processes that are relatively more difficult to electrify. Although there are some applications like in the steel industry where you already see electrification via direct reduction. Hydrogen has that role, certainly does not, and is not foreseen to have a role from a technical point of view, for instance, in applications on transport or on land, for the simple reason that if you convert energy, a second from electricity, for being clean, you have to have electrolyzers, electrolysis and electricity produced from renewables. You first have to have built a renewables capacity for utilizing it for producing en masse the large quantities of hydrogen you would have to use for the applications. And then you would have to convert it, which by a physical law wastes energy. Okay? So in no part of the Green Deal, in the taxonomy, there is a reference to hydrogen, obviously. The taxonomy has taken up a number of compromissory positions on a number of things, but in general, it is very clear in labeling by color. Hydrogen today is made out of fossil fuels. We're not talking about that. Importing hydrogen from the MENA region, from the countries in the African or Middle East, could actually be a solution for the simple reason that there is the solar capacity for producing renewables needed for converting into hydrogen. I am not, if you're asking, and this is again not much a question of provisions in the Green Deal, but how national states are implementing their climate plans. This is an issue for Germany, for instance, where for a long time, hydrogen, and still to a lesser extent, considered having a much bigger role in applications such as heating or transportation. Why? This is just because the governments are trying to save the infrastructure that exists, stranded assets. They pretend for the gas companies that the gas tax are going to be used to transport hydrogen. That does not make sense, but it's not about the Green Deal. It's about how states are integrating these provisions.
Thank you so much. I think we are going to be giving this session an end.
Yes.
With a few words from Stefano.
Yeah. So, first of all, I hope that you had meaningful and interesting input and you learned something. And of course, if you want to discuss more, there is the networking cocktail, so feel free to ask more or just enjoy the alcohol and food. And now for the closing statement, we'll turn a little bit more into the poetic side, and I hope that some of you will be inspired. So, in the epic film Gladiator, a poignant Richard Iris as Marco Aurelius speaks of a dream, a whisper so fragile it could vanish. If it wouldn't survive the winter, this dream, a paraphrase, was the European Green Deal. After the recent election, the hope for a green transition seems improbable. The chance to reverse climate change scores even more so. Like a conspiracy theorist shouting about the end of the world, we increasingly hear that the Green Deal is doomed, the people are rejecting, and that the right and far right will take power, creating a nearly cartoonish version of a dictatorship, focusing only on competition. Yet the EU persists in aligning with the Paris Agreement, our Trump moment, still at bay, but we don't know about that. We must remember we live in a democracy where decision makers answer to the people and civil society has a crucial role. Do not believe in the crude rhetoric of climate deniers or the rampant misinformation. Believe and continue to do so. Just consider what, and I will talk about Commissioner Sinkevicius Extra say at the Environmental Council press conference 2 days ago. Despite these fears, it is unlikely that the Green Deal will be dismantled. The momentum for environmental action is strong. As all surveys say, the adoption of the nature restoration law, the strong advancement in the Waste Framework Directive, Green Claims Proposal, and soil monitoring. And there is a widespread recognition of the urgent need to address climate change and environmental degradation. Therefore, the question is not whether there is a future for the European Green Deal, but how to make it more robust in the light of the period we're living through. And I conclude by saying something slightly, as I say, poetic. I'm a lover of literature and mythology, and I recall the words of a famous Italian poet, Dante Alighieri, in his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. Dante, through Ulysses, implores us, consider your origin. You were not formed to live like brutes, but to follow virtue and knowledge. This small oration holds extraordinary power. Ulysses, through careful chosen words, exhorts his companion to journey into the unknown. His words having the desired effect, he reminds them that go bestow
upon humanity free will and reason to be used wisely in pursuit of virtue and knowledge. I know we're walking into the unknown with every step, and it's scary. But I echo this call, not merely to believe in the European Green Deal, but in the power of each citizen, all as an individual and as a part of a collective. This green transition is by and for the people. It is time to rediscover this role. That's all.